Hey there. How's it
Hi.
going?
It's
Oh,
going well. I'm trying to keep one of my cats from walking across the keyboard.
as usual,
Yeah,
we
as usual. Yeah.
we don't want to get shut down in the middle of the podcast. This was a long one. It took me a solid 2 hours of note taking and prep and research and stuff.
It took me a while too. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
surprised.
Well, welcome to Goodnight, Mr. Holmes, podcast about the Granada Sherlock Holmes, which ran on ITV in the UK between 1984 and 1994, and ran on Masterpiece Mystery in the US around the same time. I'm Laura,
And I'm Rachel.
and today we are looking at episode 6 in the series, which is called The Speckled Band.
AKA fact check? No, I'm sure it's fine.
Right. Okay, so first and foremost, you need to tell me why your parents' audiobooks were always set to The Speckled Band.
Oh, my grandparents, I don't know. I think it might have been that it was my grandfather's favorite story as well.
Okay. Okay, cool. I think it's one of mine in a lot of weird ways.
Yeah,
So
the story is bonkers.
it is.
But
Yes.
it has this nice gothic feel to it that makes it fun.
Yep. Yep. So in the show, we open on a man wearing a leather apron, chasing several urchins through a wooded area, and he's crossing a stream on a little bridge when he encounters an encampment of Roma, aka gypsies, and a man in an ascot and breeches who's wielding a club and demanding to know what the other man is doing. And the man says, "I'm getting back what's rightfully mine." And the urchins had stolen a horseshoe and some nails from his blacksmith shop. And Ascot man says, "Where's your proof?" And the blacksmith says, "The proof is I'll find them there." And he gestures towards the encampment and says he doesn't want to be forced to call the police. And Ascot man then tells the blacksmith, "These people are guests of mine and you're trespassing."
Which is unusual in England. Roma don't.
They're
Uh,
not met with a lot of hospitality.
yeah,
And that's true all over Europe. And actually, I ran across, a few of them when I was on a trip to Buenos Aires.
oh wow.
So yeah, no, it's far flung. And yes, they are almost universally met with hostility.
As a Jewish person, I can relate to that.
Yep, yep, definitely. Um, the blacksmith says, "I'm not frightened of you, doctor," and they start swinging at one another. And the doctor pushes the blacksmith into the stream from the bridge, and then we see a monkey peering out from a tree at the whole spectacle.
Baboon, yeah.
A baboon.
Not really a usual sight in England.
No, not at all. And then this doctor, Ascot man, whose name is Roylott.
Dr. Grimsby Roylott of Stoke Moran. I feel like you need that entire thing every time. It just flows so nicely.
And he walks back to this manor house at Stoke Moran. And inside the house, a woman who we find out is Roylott's daughter, Helen. Stepdaughter, yes. And it doesn't look like she's a young lady. She's got like gray hairs around her temples, but her face looks really young.
Mm-hmm.
And she's talking with a man named Percy, asking him to come back soon. And Percy says there's nothing to be worried about because they're going to be married in a few weeks. And Roylott comes into the hall, and Percy thanks him for the stay and says he'll work on his chess game. And that evening, Roylott is playing chess by himself in like the main room of the manor. And he argues with Helen about the altercation in the woods. And he grabs her really hard by the wrist, like twisting it, and asks if she's part of the conspiracy against him.
Or maybe he's just an asshole.
Right. Yeah, there's always that. And she denies it. She says, "No, father, I live here." And he says, "Not for much longer once you marry that fellow Armitage." And she leaves the room. And that night, as she's going to her bedroom, she hears a bird cawing, and she sees that there's being some work done to her room, like there's piles of bricks and stuff. So she goes and knocks on Roylet's door, and he's feeding a parrot. That's the bird that we heard.
Mm.
And he says she needs to sleep in her sister's room because there's work.
Her room, yeah.
Yeah. And she says she can't sleep in there, and he dismisses her out of hand and her obvious stress.
And a perfectly good room.
Yes, tells her to get in that room, which she does. And then we see her pacing around the room in her nightgown.
Yeah, she checks the window to make sure it's shut. She fastens the shutters.
Yep. Closes the curtains. And in the night, Roylet is walking around his estate in the woods, and he wishes a leopard good night.
Again, not something you typically see on British estates.
Right. In the original story, it's a cheetah. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a cheetah.
Yeah, I have cheetah in my notes because I was going to the original story and I was staring at the screen like, but I think that's actually a leopard.
So basically, we see between the parrot, the baboon, and the cheetah that he's a collector of exotic animals.
I wonder if he kind of mentally classifies the Romas that way too.
I did not think of that. That would be a typically racist thing. I mean, especially as we're gonna get into some of this stuff anyway. But Helen is awakened by this whistling sound, and she bolts upright. She lights a match, and then she hears a door thudding. And then we're at 221B early in the morning. Holmes is apologizing to Watson, saying it seems to be the common lot this morning. And as the camera pans out, we see that Watson's still in bed. Holmes is fully dressed.
Yeah, and Watson, he looks like his room is in the attic or something because there's just a bed. You know, there's not the wallpaper that you see everywhere else.
Right.
Pictures anywhere. It's just a bed.
He's parked up. Yeah. He has to come down the stairs to get to the rest of the apartment. And a client has arrived very early in the morning. It's 7:15, which to me is not even a time.
Yeah, I was going to say, if it would me, my protest would be, it's only 10:15.
Right. Yes. It's don't even get me started. I don't.
Oh, and he asks, is it a fire?
Right.
Else would be waking me up at this hour.
Right. And it's Helen, of course, sitting in the sitting room. And Holmes asks Mrs. Hudson to bring her some hot coffee because she's shivering. But
I hear you. We just came out of a week of a polar vortex.
Yes. Yeah. So bad I had an asthma attack last night. But Helen says it's not the cold that's making her shiver, it's terror. So
Holmes says, go on.
Well, he reassures her that they'll get to the bottom of it. And then he does, his thing and deduces how she got to 221B and all of this. Mud spattered.
You came by train. And she's like, you know me? He's like, you're holding the return ticket in your hand.
But the mud spatters that could only be caused by a dog cart taking her to the train.
A dog cart, by the way, is a two-wheeled vehicle pulled by a horse.
Oh, I didn't know that. I just assumed it was like smaller than a truck. Yeah, cool. Helen says she can't stand the strain any longer, and she's going to go mad if it continues. And she was referred to Mr. Holmes by a Mrs. Farintosh. And then we see Roylet reading the letter that Mrs. Farintosh wrote to Helen saying, Holmes did this for me. If you need something like this, go to him. And Helen says she has no money now, but in a few weeks she'll be married and in control of her own finances. And Holmes says, that's fine. Just tell him everything.
His profession is its own reward.
Which is ridiculous. I mean, this man eats grouse and oysters and goes to the opera and he has a Stradivarius. I mean,
Well, the case with Mrs. Farintosh, he said, concerned an opal tiara. So
yeah.
I'm pretty sure she paid quite a bit of money.
Well, yeah, and in Scandal in Bohemia, the king paid him a ton of money too.
Yeah, and doesn't he say somewhere in the stories, or maybe it's just fans assuming that he tends to charge people what he thinks they can pay, basically.
Yeah. So yeah, this is where we find out that Helen is not Roylet's daughter, but his stepdaughter. He's from an ancient Saxon family.
The Roylets of Stoke Moran.
And he had a large medical practice in Calcutta. And Watson is beaming at this, remembering that his time when he was in India.
Attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers, which
Yes.
I did not look up, but I will do for the next episode.
I think his company varies from story to story. They landed on 5th Northumberland Fusiliers like permanently, but I think it's kind of like his wandering wound. So,
well, within the series, I think the last time he named the regiment in I can't believe I've already forgotten the name. We're only on our 6th episode. I'm already forgetting the names. That military one. I think he called it the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers too.
oh, okay.
The Crooked Man. Yeah, the one that I can never remember.
So Helen relates that in India, Roylet married Helen's mother when Helen was 2 and her sister Julia was 7. And in the original story, they're twins.
Oh.
Yeah. And the mother was somewhat wealthy and she left all her money to Roylet.
Yeah. Her mother had not less than £1,000 a year. So the story, according to the short story, takes place in 1883. So today that would be worth $155,384 a year.
Okay.
And she bequeathed it entirely to Roylet. The Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1848.
Oh.
So before that, when a woman married, everything she owned automatically became the property of the husband. So, while there was still pressure for the women to hand over all of their property to their husbands, this is over 50 years after the law passed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the implication is that her mother was either old-fashioned or that she was coerced by Roylet.
Yeah. And as we come to know Roylet, I would suspect the latter.
Yeah.
But the money only went to Roylet as long as the girls were living with him.
Mm-hmm.
And after they came back to England, like right after, she was killed in a railway accident.
So not by Roylet.
No. Unless he pushed her.
Possibly. You have a video of that? Where's the CCTV?
And in the meantime, Roylet had been trying to set up a medical practice in London. But when she died and he had access to the money, he moved the 2 girls and himself to his ancestral home in Stoke Moran. And Helen says a terrible change came over him.
Yeah, in the story, she says that there was some hereditary madness among the men in the family.
Oh, that never came up in the show.
No, it didn't.
But instead of carrying on like the country gentleman he actually is, like he doesn't socialize with anybody, makes no attempt to build up connections, in the villages or anything like that. He became a recluse and indulged himself in ferocious quarrels. And then we see a shot of the gate to the manor house, and basically it's being scaled by little barefoot boys with ropes. So this estate is obviously in a condition of some neglect because nobody's chasing these boys off the gate.
Right.
And Roylet does not allow anyone on his property except these gypsies who he's given permission to camp there.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes away with them for days at a time, Helen says.
I'm sure she and her sister were very happy when he was gone.
Yes. And he couldn't keep servants. He was such a disagreeable person. So the daughters wound up doing all the housework. And at the age of 30, Julia, the older sister, died, and her hair had already begun to whiten from the strain. So that explains, the premature gray hairs. And Roylott had kept the girls in seclusion, so they barely met anyone. But 2 years ago, Julia had managed to become engaged to a half-pay major. So basically a military man who's between postings.
Yes.
And 2 weeks before the wedding, Helen says, I lost my only companion.
And Holmes is listening to this with his eyes closed.
Yes. So Helen relates this story, the night that Julia came into Helen's room saying that Roylott was smoking his awful cigars again, and the smoke was getting into her room. And Helen's like, well, you can stay in this room. And Julia just kind of lets that go. And she says she's so happy to be leaving, but she's going to really miss Helen. And Helen tells her not to worry because Julia's fiance has promised to find her a husband too, with what did she say? A higher
equal rank and infinitely better looking.
Yes. But Julia is still worried, and she asks if Helen had ever heard anyone whistling in the dead of night. Or was she whistling herself in her sleep? Because I know I do that.
Yeah, I've never heard of anyone sleep whistling. But also, how would Helen know? She sleeps alone. Who's going to tell her?
The last few nights around 3 in the morning each time, Julia's been awakened by a low, clear whistle, and she can't tell where it's coming from. And Helen says she sleeps heavily and hasn't heard it, but it was probably the gypsies. So, I mean, again, scapegoating, like anything that's weird, blame the gypsies on the property.
Yeah.
Holmes asks if they locked up every night, and that's when Helen tells him about the animals, saying that they were afraid of them and that they couldn't sleep unless the doors and windows were locked.
Because leopards are famous for turning doorknobs.
Right. I don't know, though. I've seen some videos of cats. You just never know. And then Helen says she heard a scream and Julia staggered out of her room.
Very melodramatically.
Yes, crying out, please help me. And she goes into some kind of fit. And she says, it was the band, the Speckled Band. And Roylott comes storming out of his room saying he'll deal with this. And Julia dies in his arms.
He'll deal with this by looking at her while she dies.
Yeah, in the story, he pours brandy down her throat, which the annotated actually says, yeah, that's Dr. Watson's preferred treatment. Pour brandy down their throat.
Watson sitting there nodding in approval.
Right. Holmes asks if the whistle had a metallic sound, and Helen says yes. And on the floor of the room was the stump of a candle and a burned match, which Watson said were probably lit to see what was going on. And Holmes asks about, what did the coroner say? And Helen said he investigated with great care. Holmes confirms that the door to Julia's room had been locked from the inside. And Helen says there were no, quote unquote, marks of violence. Mm-hmm. And Watson, of course, says, what about poison? But the doctors did not find any evidence of it. So Holmes asks what she thinks Julia died of. And Helen says, pure fear and nervous shock. And Holmes asks about, what's the Speckled Band? What's that about? And Helen says, to her mind, it was delirium. And Watson at this point says, what about a band of people? The gypsies, they wear spotted handkerchiefs around their necks.
If I saw someone standing over me having just done something that would kill me, I don't know that the handkerchiefs would be what I focused on.
Well, right. And Holmes says, these are very deep waters. Helen said, since Julia's death, she was lonely until about a month ago when an old friend of indeterminate rank and vague attractiveness asked her to marry him, and they're going to be married in a few weeks. So what's the problem? Helen says due to the repairs in her room last night, she was forced to sleep in Julia's room where Julia had died, and she was awakened by the same whistle. And she lit a lamp and saw nothing, but she couldn't sleep, so she got out of bed and came to London, and that's why she's there so early in the morning.
Which is very smart.
Yes, get out. Holmes tells her that this was wise, but she hasn't told him everything. And he grabs her wrist and he says, "You're shielding your stepfather." And there's a visible bruise on her wrist where...
Yeah, the story, he says, "You have been cruelly used," which I think I like better.
Yeah. In the show, she says, "Yeah, he's a hard man, but he's the only father she's ever known." At which point Watson wants breakfast. And this is a theme in this episode.
Yes.
Holmes asks about Stoke Moran. Can he and Watson go there unnoticed? And as it happens, Roylott is coming to London on business, so the house will be empty. And Holmes says they will be there this afternoon. And as she's leaving, Watson asks her to stay for breakfast, but she says no. And as soon as she leaves, Mrs. Hudson arrives with Watson's highly desired breakfast. And as he's dishing it out for himself, Roylott barges in, to Watson's shock. And frankly, I was like, wait, didn't Helen see Roylott coming up the stairs as she was going down? It was that quick.
Yeah, I think it was less than a minute.
And he's yelling, "Which one of you is Holmes?" And Holmes asks, basically, "Who the hell are you?" And Roylott introduces himself imperiously. Holmes asks him to take a seat, and Watson says he'll do nothing of the kind. Not Watson, Roylott says he'll do nothing of the kind. "I know that my stepdaughter has been here this morning. What has she been saying to you?" And Holmes says something really weird. He says, "It is a little cold for this time of year, but I have heard the crops promise well."
There's a knitting forum that I like to post in every now and then, and whenever a troll comes in, they start posting recipes.
Oh,
like the trolls don't post recipes, the posters post recipes
right.
until the troll leaves. And I feel like that's basically what Holmes is doing here.
Yeah, I mean, I got the sense that Holmes was like deliberately trying to piss him off.
Mm-hmm.
And Roylott is pissed off, and he accuses Holmes of like basically trying to get rid of him. And then he gets in real close, and he calls Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office. And Holmes is laughing, and then sternly tells him, "Close the door on your way out." And Roylott says, "I'll go when I've had my say. Don't interfere in my affairs." And then he grabs the fireplace poker and he bends it in half and says, "I'm a dangerous man to fall foul of."
Yeah, piss him off and he might bend fireplace pokers at you.
Right. And poor Mrs. Hudson has been cowering in the doorway this whole time. Roylott strides past her, and Holmes says, "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Just another client." And she closes his door. Holmes picks up the bent poker and says, "What an amiable person. I may not be quite so bulky, but..." And he straightens the poker out himself. And Watson is just like, "What?" And Holmes is laughing. And essentially says, "Imagine being so clueless as to confuse me with Scotland Yard."
I love that that's what he's offended by.
Exactly, yes. And Watson, at this point, expresses concern about Helen since Roylott was able to follow her.
And she allowed herself to be tracked here. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, it's clearly all her fault.
Yeah.
But he is concerned, which, and Holmes, just gallops right past him.
Right.
And is asking about Roylott's career in India. Why would he give that up for a life of quote unquote aristocratic penury?
Yeah, we'll get into that in the next scene, I think.
Yeah, Watson says his friend Coombs would know because he was in Calcutta at the same time. So Holmes is like, "Reach out to that guy, and I'm going down to Doctors' Commons," which is not anything having to do with medical doctors, but it's basically the headquarters of civil litigation in London. And so he's striding around in an overcoat and a deerstalker, a light gray, both of them. So not your classic tweed. So maybe it's his summer deerstalker.
Maybe, except Helen was cold, right, when she came in?
Yeah, I don't understand. I mean, why are you wearing light colors? Well, anyway, he tells Watson he's going to meet him at 1 o'clock under the clock in Waterloo Station. That is, if you've finished your breakfast by then.
As Holmes, who apparently gets his food through photosynthesis or something.
I know. He's really scornful of Watson's need to nourish himself. And he tells him to bring his revolver. And Ely number 2 is an excellent argument against gentlemen who can twist pokers into knots. And a pack of toothbrush.
Which they won't be using.
Right. But it is the indication they're going to be staying overnight.
Right.
Next, we see Holmes and Watson on the train. And Holmes has been investigating Helen's mother's will at Doctors' Commons. And he tells Watson that her investments have lost some value. And if both girls had married and taken their...
So due to the fall in agricultural prices,
yes.
It's now no more than 750 pounds. In today's money, that's 116,538 pounds.
So if they each took their share of the inheritance, Roylott would have been left with very little.
Okay, so each girl in case of marriage could claim 250. So in today's money, 38,846. So that would leave Roylott with only the same amount of money, which they describe as a mere pittance.
Yeah.
Which, to live on that in New Jersey, but not exactly a pittance.
No, but it's funny that they describe it as a pittance for him, but for the women, it's a sizable inheritance.
Yeah.
It's the same amount of money cut 3 ways.
Mm-hmm.
And Watson says even one marriage would ruin him.
Yes, the horror of having the equivalent of 77,692 pounds a year without having to do anything to earn it.
Right.
My heart is bleeding for him.
I know. So the camera pans around and we're looking at that reenactment, essentially, of the famous Sidney Paget illustration of the two of them on the train, which is a beautiful shot.
Yes.
That's one of my favorites. And Holmes asks about Coombs. And it turns out he did know Roylott and confirmed what Helen said, but there was something more. There was a series of robberies in Roylott's house, and his butler, who was a native of Calcutta, was suspected. And Roylott beat the man to death and spent a long time in prison and returned to England a morose and disappointed man.
Which is Victorian British for, God, he was an asshole.
Yes. And I wonder why Helen never brought that up, because presumably she was living in Calcutta with him at the time. But,
yeah. And
what would his wife have said?
Yeah.
And
maybe
Holmes,
she was born to secrecy or something. Maybe she feels some familial shame about it.
or as usual, Conan Doyle has a plot hole the size of Brian Tar Pits.
In this story? No way.
And Holmes says, it's a wicked world, and when a clever man turns his brains to crime, it's the worst of all. So they leave the train, they get in a trap to Stoke Moran from the station, telling the driver that they're architects doing research on local houses. And
Holmes pulls his hat down over his eyes like, ooh, better not recognize me as a famous architect.
And the driver said, yeah, I didn't think you were coming here for social reasons. And he tells them to take care. There are some around these parts that say he's not right in the head.
Can't imagine why.
He tells them about the blacksmith going into the stream and that Helen paid the blacksmith some money not to go to the authorities about it, which Watson is absolutely smitten. Happens to meet them at the gate.
He goes on and on about how admirable she is.
Yes. And they tell Helen about Roylott in London, that he came in after she had left, but reassure her that he's no match for them. And then they go scoping out the exterior of the house. And they're walking around, looking through the windows of the various rooms. And Watson says bedrooms on the ground floor. And Helen says they were moved downstairs when the upstairs rooms fell into disrepair.
So obviously the mother's inheritance is not being used for upkeep.
No, it is not. Holmes examines the stonework and says that there's little need for repair to Helen's current room. And Helen agrees, and she said that she thinks it was an excuse to move her into Julia's room for that night. So Holmes asked her to go into that room, into Julia's room, and bolt the shutters. And as she goes inside, Holmes sees Watson kneeling on the ground. And he asks, "What are you doing?" And Watson's like, he says, I'm using your methods to see if the ground has been disturbed. And Holmes says, "What have you come up with?" And Watson says, "Your footprints, I believe, and mine and Miss Stoner's." But he also points out a large animal print in the soft dirt.
Yeah,
so,
that was a cute little interaction.
Yeah, it was. It was. And at least Holmes didn't outright make fun of him at that point.
Yeah, that's true.
Helen closes the shutters from the inside, and Holmes attempts to get past them through the window. And he can't. They're too strong. So they walk around, go through the entrance, go into her room, and Holmes is kind of taking it all in. Watson, meanwhile, is looking at the photo of Percy, the fiance, by the bedside, sort of regretfully, like, she will never be mine. And Holmes notices a bell pull, which Helen tells him goes to the housekeeper's room. It's like this long velvet rope with silk sort of
cord twining around it.
Yeah. And he says it looks newer than the other things, but she tells him it was only installed a couple of years ago. "Your sister asked for it," Holmes said, "but she said, I never heard of her using it. We used to get what we wanted for ourselves." And then Holmes starts crawling around on the floor with his magnifying glass, looking at the floorboards. Then he hops up and he yanks on the bell pull, but it doesn't ring. So there's no bell attached to it. And above the bell pull is this ventilator, like it's a metal screen with holes in it that leads outside, which Helen says is
no, it doesn't lead outside. That's what's unusual about it. It leads to Roylet's
room. Yeah, but that was confusing to me because Holmes said something about getting fresh air through the ventilator. And
I think they were saying she wouldn't be able to get it.
Oh, okay. Because it goes to Roylet's room.
Yeah.
So then,
and that's also quite modern, as she puts it. It's
new. Watson yanks on the bell pull himself. I don't know why. And then they go into Roylet's room, and there's a large freestanding safe, like this big red thing with legs, in the middle of the room, which Helen says holds her father's business papers. And Holmes says, "So you've seen inside it?" And Helen says, "Only once, some years ago." And then Holmes asks, "Is there a cat in there?" And Helen says, "No." But there is.
I know. Who would have a cat as a pet? What a silly idea.
Holmes picks up a saucer that clearly had been holding some milk. And Helen said, "We don't keep a cat." And Holmes said, "A leopard is a very large cat." And Watson says, "Yeah, but a saucer of milk wouldn't be enough for a leopard."
And Holmes gives him this like weird smile, like, "Yeah, I was joking."
Right. But he jokes so rarely, it's not surprising. And Watson says, "Surely the leopard is kept on a leash." And Holmes grabs a leash that's draped on the nearby chair and asks Watson what he makes of it. And Watson says it's a common dog leash, but it's tied in a little loop at the end. And Helen says they have no dog. So Holmes says he's seen enough, and they go outside. And he asks about the cottage that they passed on their way to the house. Can they see the windows of Julia's room from the cottage? And Helen says yes. So Holmes says they'll make that their base of operations. And she offers them some refreshment.
"Would you like some tea?"
And Watson says, "We shall have dined, like we're going to go get dinner.
Like Holmes, right?
And Holmes rolls his eyes, literally, and asks if there's a village inn. And as they're setting off towards the village inn, I guess, he tells Helen that when Roylott returns, she is to go to her room saying she has a headache. When she hears him going to bed, she has to open the shutters and leave her lamp on the windowsill. Then she should go to her old room, despite the repairs. And as he and Watson start to go, she says she thinks that Holmes has already solved the case. For pity's sake, tell me the cause of my sister's death. And Holmes tells her to be brave and do it.
Also, if he told her, she'd like fall over laughing and then go hire somebody else.
Exactly. Presumably, after Watson's dinner, they go to the cottage where they can see the window. And Watson asks if this is going to take all night, and Holmes says it's possible. And for some reason, Holmes is taking off his shoes.
Oh, I guess to muffle sound while they walk around. I don't know.
Yeah, no clue.
Holmes shrugs and says, anything's possible. You know, it could be like a milk drinking snake responding to the sound of a whistle. Anything's possible.
And then he speculates about doctors gone rogue. And he cites the cases of Palmer and Pritchard. And these were real.
Mm-hmm.
From like 30 years before this story was written. I mean, even Dickens was like appalled by Palmer in particular.
Yeah. In 1865, Pritchard poisoned his wife and mother-in-law with the antimony and aconite. Some of it was found in the tapioca pudding he made for his wife, which was enough to get him convicted. He was the last public execution in Scotland. And the motive, apparently, was that he was having an affair with a 15-year-old maid.
I wouldn't call that an affair.
No, I wouldn't either. In 1846, Palmer had racked up debts and was into gambling, went to the races with a friend. He lost, the friend won. He gave the friend a celebratory drink, and the friend complained of burning and later died. At the inquest, there was testimony that the symptoms were typical of strychnine. 4 of his 5 children had died in infancy. And Maid had testified that she'd heard Palmer saying he couldn't afford them. And his wife and brother died mysteriously after Palmer took life insurance on them.
Oh, yeah, that's horrific.
Yeah.
Both of them. And then Holmes says that Roylott is worse than these. And that there's so much danger. He's way
more creative.
Yeah, probably. There's so much danger. He's uncomfortable bringing Watson into it. But of course, Watson says, if I could be of assistance, and Holmes says, that's very kind of you. And that's about as emotional as they get in friendship.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very emotional moment of mutual, like, I'm worried about you. Yeah, but I'm going to support you. And Holmes reminds Watson that Julia had said she could smell Roylott's cigar. So the ventilator would account for that. Yeah, you're right. It opens into Roylott's room.
Yeah, although I bought the house that I'm living in 16 years ago, and over the years, I every now and then smell cigarette smoke, and I think, oh, well, maybe the neighbors smoke and they have their windows open. It took me 16 years to figure out that a former owner had smoked. So, that smell is like you cannot get rid of it. So, sure, I'm sure even if there wasn't a ventilator, she could smell a cigar.
So, like, it's in the insulation.
It gets into everything.
Oh, that's gross. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry it's there.
You don't smell it often. Just like every once in a while, there's.
I've never smelled it when I come to visit you.
Yeah,
that's why I'm surprised.
But that's why it took me so long.
Yeah. So remember when Holmes was crawling around on the floor before he goes and yanks the bell pull? He's noticed that the bed was clamped to the floor, so it couldn't be moved. So it had to remain in position with regard to both the ventilator and the bell pull, which Holmes insists on calling the rope.
Because that's basically what it is.
It's just a rope, yeah. And Watson notes or says that they're only just in time to prevent some subtle and horrible crime.
So subtle, it's really hard to figure out from this.
Yeah. So they hear the sounds of Roylet's horse pass by, and then Roylet walks. He dismounts and gives the horse to a couple of the gypsies who are on his property, and he walks by the cottage on his way to the house, and doesn't, suspect anything. Helen is in the main room by the fire embroidering, and this is what really struck me. This is the first time they've seen one another since Helen went to London and Roylet followed her.
Yeah.
So it's a big, like, I know that I know that you know kind of. She asks if he's had a good day, and he starts reading the newspaper, which, by the way, these newspapers back then, the print was so tiny.
Yeah. Well, even like 30 years ago, the print in mass market paperbacks was really, really small. Yeah. So, I think larger print is a fairly new thing.
Yes. So she asks if he had a good day, and he says, not without interest. Where did you get to this morning? As if he doesn't know. And she says she decided to go to town to do some shopping for the wedding. So neither one of them is acknowledging what's really going on. And he says it's a shame they could have traveled together. And she said she wanted to be back by lunchtime, and her trip was just a whim. And Roylet says, you are always a good little liar.
And he would know.
So Helen's like, I got a headache, I'm leaving.
Yeah, fuck this conversation, bye.
Roylet mutters, Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard, Jack in office. And the leopard is prowling around while Holmes is keeping watch from the cottage windows.
Yeah, so the implication is, because they have to get from the cottage to the house, the implication is there's this leopard supposedly keeping guard.
Yep. And they see Holmes sees the lamp go out in the window, and he wakes Watson, who's asleep. Yes, as they leave the cottage, Watson is brandishing his revolver, and Holmes has a long stick. And they encounter the baboon, but I guess it's harmless.
Yeah, I guess they see something and crouch down in some long grass. Roylet hire somebody to mow his lawn, and then realize it's the baboon.
And then they proceed to the house, not encountering the leopard at all.
Yeah.
And they enter the bedroom via the window. There's a lot of entering rooms via long, tall windows in this series.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost every episode.
I'm surprised Holmes never had a client who came in through the window.
That would be a great, all of him is in the public domain now. We could do that.
We could.
Holmes puts out the lamp, and he locks up the shutters, and he whispers to Watson not to fall asleep because his life may depend on it. And we see Holmes is trembling.
Yeah, so you can imagine how tense this scene is in an audio dramatization, because you're just hearing Holmes whispering.
Yeah.
And saying things like your very life might depend on it. And your imagination is filling in the rest of it.
And it's dark. It's not just quiet, it's dark.
Yeah, they have to sit in the dark.
And meanwhile, we see Helen in her old room lying awake in fear. And then Holmes lights a candle and hears a hissing sound and begins banging on the rope with that stick he's got.
You see it, Watson?
Yes. And Roylet, then we hear Roylet screaming. And so Holmes and Watson run around to Roylet's room with Watson's revolver.
What can it mean? It means that it's over.
Yes, it's over. And Roylet is extremely dead in a chair by the open safe with a snake around his neck. And Holmes says, it's the band, the Speckled Band. It is a swamp adder, the deadliest snake in India. He has
Yeah.
died within seconds of being bitten.
Yeah. Also, that's not a real animal.
No. But they can make anything up if it exists, or if he wants it to exist in Africa.
If Google didn't exist, then it was fine.
Well, if it's in Africa, India, or America, then Conan Doyle's just going to make it up.
Yeah.
Because who's going to check him?
Exactly. See the subtitle. I'm sure it's fine.
So Holmes picks up that little leash with the loop, and he loops it around the snake's head.
Because snakes have very distinct necks, and you can do that with snakes.
Is that true, or are you kidding?
I am joking.
Okay. I hate snakes. I am so phobic of snakes. I don't want to know anything about them, so I refuse to learn.
We used to live in Florida when I was younger.
Oh God, no.
And my mother, the story is according to my dad, my mother encountered a black snake in the backyard. And according to him, they looked at each other and then each ran away in separate directions.
I have conceded entire areas of Staten Island where I live to the snakes that live there. I will not go.
There are that many.
Stepped in a nest of baby snakes once, and I have not been the same.
Oh my God.
Yes. I mean, they were little, garden snake. They're harmless, but I'm like, no, and I ran back to my car and sped home.
I'd be terrified of snakes too after that.
Oh God, no, I can't even. So I was glad that the snake actually wasn't featured too much in the show. Yeah. So Holmes puts it back in the safe where it belongs, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, snakes apparently don't need air.
And he remarks that violence returns upon the violent.
And the schemer falls into the pit which he digs for another.
Which is sort of a Bible quote. And again, is like, it establishes that Holmes has been classically educated in England. Mm-hmm. We don't know if he actually went to Eton, but probably there or similar. And you're getting an Anglican education there.
Yeah.
And then they're all back on the train with Helen, and Holmes goes out over how he reached his conclusions that Roylott had exotic animals. The poison from the snake would not be discovered by any test that the coroner would run. And while the snake might not bite on any given night, sooner or later it would. And this is what was freaking me out, was this snake was going into Julia's room night after night after night and slithering around her.
Yeah.
And Roylott,
a demon and paranormal activity.
Roylott had been using the whistle and the saucer of milk to train the snake to come back up the bell pool and back through the ventilator to come back to him. Because you can do that. And when Holmes beat it with his stick, I aroused its snakish temper.
I loved that phrase.
I know. And it struck at Roylott. And Watson points out that, well, Holmes is indirectly responsible for Roylott's death.
I would say it's likely to weigh very heavily on my conscience.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, Holmes is not going to lose any sleep over this, and he never does when it comes to these reprobates.
Yeah. Extrajudicial.
Yeah.
Actions.
This is the part. So in the BBC Sherlock, when Holmes shoots the blackmailer and kills him, and everyone was all in an uproar about, he would never do that. He would never do. Are you kidding? Do you know how many people Holmes has actually killed?
There was some essay I was reading years ago that pointed out that it wasn't often one murder where you would need a great detective, as soon as Holmes shows up, or Poirot or Miss Marple, like, you can guarantee people are going to start dropping left and right.
Yes. One way or the other. So tell me what you learned about snakes and milk.
Well, over the closing credits, we see the snake sliding down the rope for like a really long time.
I bailed at that point. I got to the end of the narrative. I'm gone.
And during the episode, like mostly we just see Holmes, waving the stick when he's hitting the snake. We don't see a whole lot. After the snake is sliding down the rope with the closing credits, we get an angle where we can see him like hitting the snake on the bed. I assume rubber snake or something. So it's from a different angle. So snakes can drink milk, like if they're dehydrated and there's no other option. And it's not like there isn't a long history of people adopting wild animals with no idea how to care for them. And that still happens, by the way, with wild animals from Africa and India. There was, I think, fairly recently an instance of, and watch, this will turn out to be like 6 years ago, in Istanbul, the customs agents found a baby gorilla that had been, crammed into this box and rescued it. And
oh my God.
yeah, so this still happens. You can see stories on YouTube of orangutans who had been rescued from people who had been keeping them as pets, and they were horrifically malnourished because they didn't know how to take care of
Right. Yeah, and we do see that actually in the New York area as well.
Yeah.
There was a guy on Staten Island who kept a zebra who was a bonded pair with a donkey.
Okay. That's not something you hear very often.
I was just reminded, actually. Do you remember I think it was like 2015. It was like 10 years ago. The gold and white or blue and black dress.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so everyone was obsessed with that. That happened in the afternoon, but in the morning, everyone was obsessed by these llamas who had escaped and were running around, and like the cops were like Keystone cops. They could not capture these llamas. So yeah, there's a whole, like, I mean, there was the guy who had a tiger in his apartment in the Bronx.
Yeah, that's also a thing with tigers.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. There's this thing of, hey, do you want to be photographed with tiger cubs? And yeah, they're not treated very well.
No. Well, when COVID first hit, everyone was obsessed with the Tiger King show on Netflix because there was nothing else going on.
True.
And there are these estates actually in England that do have menageries. Essentially, there's Longleat, which is the home of the Marquis of Bath. And he was an eccentric character. So he built up this huge menagerie. He also had what he called wifelets living in cottages on his estate. And his main house was filled with all this pornographic art. And he remained married. They were separated, but they never got divorced. And she also lived in one of the cottages.
But when was this?
This was in 70s, 80s, 90s. He died maybe 10 years ago. His son exceeded. His son married a Nigerian woman, and the mother wouldn't come to the wedding because she's racist. Just all get out.
Mm-hmm.
But they still run the menagerie, and it's got cheetahs, lions, and it's not that warm in England.
No.
But they also stage like music festivals there and stuff. But it is a thing. So there was also a private zoo in London. And the guy who ran it was a friend of Lord Lucan, who was the
Speaking of murderers.
Yes, the guy who killed the nanny, thinking he was killing his wife. And so this guy who ran the zoo was suspected of being part of the cover-up of all that. Yeah, it was a weird scene. It was a zoo that was also associated with a gambling club.
Oh God.
I mean, it's the 70s in London, and the English are
The
known,
70s in general were just, it was a
yeah,
weird.
it's eccentricity piled on top of eccentricity. Any other notes about this one?
Let's see. Snakes can feel vibrations and can, air quotes, hear low sounds, but even a low whistle, I mean, that's still pretty high pitched.
Yeah.
And the only other note that I have is that the Romani language is related to Sanskrit,
Yes.
which is another Indian connection the Doctor has.
I think, yeah, that's true. I wonder if they knew back then.
I don't think so. I think that's
It's
fairly
really,
modern,
recent.
but it's interesting.
The whole like Romani setup in this story was just completely irrelevant.
Yeah, it was. It was there to show his eccentricity.
Or to cast blame in a certain direction, a band of people, the speckled bands, that they have around their necks. Another like, okay, we're going to blame the gypsies now.
Yeah, the speckled band. So much easier for a dying woman to say than snake.
Snake!
I don't. Maybe it was Julia's parting gift to Helen. Like, I'll leave you with a fun gothic mystery. It's a snake. The speckled band. What is wrong with you?
Well, it's been real. What do we got coming up?
Okay, so I'll give the outro. That's all from us this week. If you've enjoyed the show and haven't subscribed yet, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support us, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends. And join us next week when we will be discussing the Blue Carbuncle.
Oh, the Blue Carbuncle. Oh,
that's another fun one.
This is one I know I say this every time, but it is one of my favorites. And there's such a great, okay. We will also be talking about John Finnemore's program, Cabin Pressure, which starred Benedict Cumberbatch as an inept pilot. And they had this whole episode right after he got the Sherlock role, where they essentially reenacted the Blue Carbuncle from the point of view of
really
a inept
I'll have to listen to that
co-pilot. Yeah, it was fabulous. All right. Well, then we will talk again next week.
Bye.
Bye.